The grand ballroom of Ravenshire Manor had been transformed into a vision of matrimonial splendor, with cascades of white roses and golden ribbons adorning every surface, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across the assembled guests, and an atmosphere of expectation that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It was to have been the wedding of the season, the union of Duke Thomas Ravenshire and Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, a match that had been celebrated by society as both romantically perfect and politically advantageous. But now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the manor's main drawing room, the scene had transformed from one of celebration to one of devastating humiliation. Lady Eleanor Whitcomb stood in the center of the room, her wedding dress, a masterpiece of silk and French lace that had taken months to create, now feeling like a costume from a play that had gone horribly wrong. Her dark chestnut hair was still perfectly arranged beneath her pearl-adorned veil, her emerald eyes still bright with the tears she refused to shed, and her delicate features still composed despite the chaos that had erupted around her. At 23, Eleanor possessed the kind of classical beauty that artists dreamed of capturing: high cheekbones, a graceful neck, and an innate elegance that made even her simplest movements appear choreographed. But more than her physical beauty, she was known throughout London society for her intelligence, her wit, and her unwavering integrity, qualities that had attracted Duke Thomas Ravenshire and led to their engagement 6 months earlier. Now, those same qualities seemed to count for nothing as she faced the cold judgment of the Ravenshire family and their assembled guests. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible mistake," the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire was saying, her voice carrying the kind of Arctic authority that had cowed lesser mortals for decades. Margaret Ravenshire was a woman who had ruled society through sheer force of will and an absolute conviction in her own superiority. At 65, she remained formidable, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate style, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a bearing that suggested she had never been contradicted in her life. "A mistake?" Eleanor repeated, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread that was settling in her chest. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that makes this wedding impossible," the Dowager replied with the casual cruelty of someone discussing an unfortunate change in the weather. "You see, my dear, we have recently discovered certain irregularities in your family's financial situation that make this union unsuitable." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Irregularities? I don't understand." "My father's estates are well managed, our debts are minimal." "Your father's estates," interrupted Lord Charles Ravenshire, Thomas's younger brother and heir presumptive, "are apparently mortgaged to the hilt. We've received information suggesting that the Earl of Whitcomb is on the verge of bankruptcy, and that this marriage was arranged primarily to access our family's wealth." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She looked around the room, seeking some sign of support from the assembled guests, many of whom she had considered friends, but found only averted eyes and uncomfortable silence. The cream of London society, people who had praised her beauty and intelligence just hours earlier, now seemed eager to distance themselves from what was clearly becoming a scandal. "That's not true," Eleanor said firmly, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "My father would never—" "Your father," the Dowager said with icy precision, "has been living beyond his means for years. The information we've received suggests that he owes substantial sums to various creditors, and that he saw this marriage as a way to solve his financial difficulties." "Where is Thomas?" Eleanor asked, looking around the room for her fiancé. "Where is the Duke? Surely he doesn't believe these accusations." Lord Charles exchanged a meaningful glance with his mother before answering. "My brother has been informed of the situation. He agrees that under these circumstances the marriage cannot proceed." "Then let him tell me himself," Eleanor demanded, her composure beginning to crack despite her best efforts. "Let him look me in the eye and tell me that he believes I would deceive him about something so fundamental." "The Duke," the Dowager said with finality, "has no wish to cause you further embarrassment. He has asked us to handle this matter with as much discretion as possible." Eleanor felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "Discretion? You're humiliating me in front of half of London society, and you call this discretion? We are preventing a greater scandal," Lord Charles replied coldly. "Surely you can see that a marriage based on financial deception would be far more damaging to all concerned than a broken engagement." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sound of carriages arriving and departing as word of the cancelled wedding spread. Eleanor stood in the centre of it all, feeling as though she were trapped in a nightmare from which she could not wake. She had loved Thomas Ravenshire with all her heart. Their courtship had been everything she had dreamed of, passionate, romantic, filled with long conversations about literature and politics, shared laughter, and the kind of deep connection that she had believed would last a lifetime. He had proposed to her in the rose garden of her family's estate, speaking of love and partnership and a future filled with happiness. Now that future was crumbling around her, and the man she had trusted with her heart was nowhere to be seen. "I want to see the evidence," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable murmur of conversation that had begun among the guests. "If my family's finances are in such dire straits, I want to see the proof." The dowager's expression grew even colder. "I hardly think that's necessary. I think it's entirely necessary," Eleanor interrupted, her emerald eyes flashing with anger. "You're destroying my reputation and my future based on accusations that I've had no opportunity to examine or refute. The least you can do is show me the evidence that has convinced you of my family's supposed deception." Lord Charles stepped forward, his expression suggesting that he found Eleanor's demands both inappropriate and tiresome. "Miss Whitcomb, I think you fail to understand your position. You are no longer welcome in this house or in this family. The kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to accept the situation with grace and withdraw quietly." "Withdraw to what?" Eleanor asked, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain her composure. "My reputation will be destroyed by this. Every person in this room will spread the story of how I was cast out on my wedding day, how I was revealed to be a fortune hunter who tried to deceive one of England's most prominent families. Where exactly am I supposed to withdraw to?" "That," the dowager said with breathtaking callousness, "is hardly our concern. You should have considered the consequences before you and your family embarked on this deception." The cruelty of the statement seemed to shock even some of the assembled guests, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up in Eleanor's defense. No one challenged the Ravenshire family's version of events. No one offered her the support that basic human decency should have demanded. Eleanor looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people she had thought were her friends, people who had accepted her hospitality, people who had praised her character and intelligence. Now they sat in silence, complicit in her humiliation through their refusal to speak. "Very well," she said finally, her voice steady despite the pain that was tearing through her chest. "I can see that I'm not welcome here, but I want you all to remember this moment. I want you to remember how easily you accepted accusations without proof, how quickly you abandoned someone you claimed to respect, how willing you were to participate in cruelty rather than stand up for justice." She began to move toward the door, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her, but as she reached the threshold, she turned back to face the room one last time. "And when the truth comes out, as it always does, I want you to remember that you chose to be on the wrong side of it." With that, she walked out of the drawing room, through the entrance hall where her wedding presents were still displayed, and out the front door of Ravenshire Manor. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of conversation as the guests began to dissect what they had just witnessed, already transforming her pain into entertainment for their social gatherings. Eleanor's carriage was waiting in the circular drive, her trunks already loaded by servants who had clearly been informed of the situation. As she climbed inside, she caught a glimpse of movement at one of the upper windows, and felt her heart leap with hope that Thomas had finally come to speak with her. But the figure at the window was not her former fiancé. It was a maid, probably watching the drama unfold with the same morbid fascination as the guests downstairs. As the carriage began to move down the long drive that led away from Ravenshire Manor, Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear something vital from her chest. She had lost everything: her fiancé, her future, her reputation, her place in society. Worse, she had lost her faith in the people she had trusted, her belief in the fundamental decency of the world she had been raised to navigate. The journey back to her family's estate took 3 hours. 3 hours during which Eleanor tried to compose herself and prepare for the conversation she would have to have with her parents. If the Ravenshire family's accusations were true, if her father was indeed facing financial ruin, then her humiliation was only the beginning of her family's troubles. But as the carriage turned into the familiar gates of Whitcomb Hall, Eleanor felt a spark of determination kindle in her chest. She might have been cast out like she was nothing, but she was not nothing. She was Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of an earl, educated, intelligent, and possessed of a strength that she was only beginning to discover. Whatever had happened today, whatever forces had conspired to destroy her happiness, she would find a way to survive. She would uncover the truth behind the accusations that had ruined her wedding, and she would make sure that justice was served, even if she had to fight for it alone. The carriage drew to a stop in front of Whitcomb Hall, and Eleanor stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, her wedding dress rustling around her like the remnants of a dream. She looked up at the familiar facade of her childhood home and squared her shoulders. The battle for her reputation and her future was just beginning. The investigation. The library at Whitcomb Hall had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in books and find solace in the orderly world of knowledge and learning. Now, 3 days after her humiliation at Ravenshire Manor, it had become her war room, its mahogany table covered with ledgers, correspondence, and legal documents as she tried to piece together the truth behind the accusations that had destroyed her wedding. Her father, the Earl of Whitcomb, sat across from her, his usually robust appearance diminished by the weight of recent events. At 58, Richard Whitcomb had always been a man of dignity and integrity, respected throughout their county for his fair dealing and generous nature. But now his face was drawn with worry, his grey hair dishevelled from running his hands through it, and his brown eyes, so like Eleanor's own, filled with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "I've gone through every document 3 times, he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Our finances are exactly as I reported to the Duke's family during the marriage negotiations. Yes, we have some debts, but they're well within manageable limits. The estate is profitable, our investments are sound, and we have substantial reserves." Eleanor looked up from the letter she was reading, her emerald eyes bright with the intensity of her focus. "Then where did these accusations come from? Someone provided the Ravenshire family with information that convinced them we were on the verge of bankruptcy. Information detailed enough to include specific amounts and creditors. Information that was completely fabricated," her father replied grimly. "The question is who would go to such lengths to prevent your marriage, and why?" Eleanor set down the letter and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. "It has to be someone with access to financial records, someone who could create convincing forgeries, and someone with a motive for wanting to destroy my relationship with Thomas." "Any number of people could have such a motive," her father observed. "You were marrying one of the most eligible men in England. There are probably dozens of families who would have preferred to see their daughters in your position. But how many of them would have the resources and connections necessary to orchestrate something like this?" Eleanor asked. This wasn't a simple rumor or piece of gossip. This was a coordinated attack designed to destroy my reputation at the worst possible moment. Her mother, Lady Catherine Whitcomb, entered the library carrying a tea service, her usually serene expression marked by lines of worry and indignation. At 52, she retained much of the beauty that had made her one of the most sought-after debutantes of her generation, but the events of recent days had taken their toll. "I've been speaking with some of our neighbours," she said, setting down the tea tray and taking a seat beside her husband. "The story has spread throughout the county, but the reactions have been interesting." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, accepting a cup of tea gratefully. "I mean that several people have expressed skepticism about the accusations," Lady Catherine replied. "Lord Pemberton in particular seemed quite surprised when I told him what had happened. He said he had recently seen your father's financial records in connection with a business venture, and that they showed nothing but prosperity and sound management." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Did he say anything else? "He mentioned that he had been approached several weeks ago by someone claiming to represent the Ravenshire family's interests, asking detailed questions about our family's finances. At the time, he assumed it was part of the normal due diligence for the marriage settlement, but now he's wondering if there was a more sinister purpose." "Who approached him?" Eleanor's father asked, leaning forward with interest. He couldn't remember the name, but he described the man as well-dressed, well-spoken, and carrying credentials that appeared to be legitimate. Lord Pemberton said he answered the questions honestly, providing information that would have shown our family to be in excellent financial health. Eleanor felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. So someone was gathering accurate information about our finances, but then presenting false information to the Ravenshire family. The question is, who had the resources and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate deception? A knock at the library door interrupted their conversation, and the family's butler entered with a silver tray bearing a single letter. "Forgive the interruption, my lord," he said with the formal courtesy that had characterized his service for 30 years. "But this just arrived by special messenger. The gentleman said it was urgent." Eleanor took the letter, noting the expensive paper and the unfamiliar seal pressed into dark blue wax. The handwriting was bold and confident, suggesting someone accustomed to authority. "It's addressed to me," she said with surprise, breaking the seal and unfolding the single sheet of paper. As she read, her expression changed from curiosity to astonishment. "What is it?" her father asked, noting her reaction. "It's from Lord Alexander Ravenshire," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas's older brother. the one who's been traveling in India for the past 2 years. What does he say? Eleanor read the letter aloud, her voice growing stronger as she absorbed the implications of its contents. Lady Eleanor, I have just returned to England and learned of the events that transpired at what should have been your wedding to my brother. I am writing to inform you that I have reason to believe the accusations made against your family's financial situation are not only false, but deliberately fabricated. If you are willing to receive me, I would like to call upon you tomorrow afternoon to discuss this matter in detail. I believe I have information that will be of considerable interest to you, and I suspect that together we may be able to uncover the truth behind this conspiracy. I remain with sincere apologies for my family's treatment of you. Alexander Ravenshire, Duke of Blackwood. Eleanor set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He believes the accusations were fabricated, and he wants to help me prove it. Alexander Ravenshire, her father mused. I remember him from before he left for India. Brilliant man with a reputation for absolute integrity. If he's offering to help, it's because he genuinely believes an injustice has been done. But why would he go against his own family? Eleanor asked. Even if he believes I've been wronged, supporting me means challenging his mother and brother publicly. Perhaps, her father suggested, he values truth more than family loyalty. Or perhaps he knows something about this situation that we don't. Eleanor felt a spark of hope for the first time since her humiliation at Ravenshire Manor. The Duke of Blackwood was one of the most respected men in England, known for his business acumen, his philanthropic work, and his complete independence from the social pressures that influenced lesser men. If he was willing to investigate the accusations against her family, he might be able to uncover evidence that would clear her name. I'll receive him, she decided. Whatever information he has, whatever help he's offering, I need to hear it. The next afternoon, Eleanor waited in the drawing room of Whitcomb Hall, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue silk that complemented her colouring without being ostentatious. She had chosen her attire carefully, wanting to project dignity and composure rather than the desperate gratitude of someone clinging to a lifeline. When the Duke of Blackwood was announced, Eleanor rose to greet him with the formal courtesy appropriate to his rank, but she was not prepared for the impact of his physical presence. Alexander Ravenshire was 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to fill whatever room he entered. His hair was dark brown with threads of premature silver at the temples. His eyes were a striking grey blue that seemed to see everything, and his features were strong and aristocratic without being harsh. 2 years in India had given his skin a slight tan that only enhanced his natural magnetism, and there was an air of worldly sophistication about him that spoke of experiences far beyond the drawing rooms of London society. But what struck Eleanor most was the intelligence in his eyes and the genuine concern in his expression as he bowed over her hand. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and resonant with a slight roughness that suggested recent travel, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be a difficult time for you." "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, gesturing for him to take a seat while she settled herself across from him. "I must admit, your letter came as quite a surprise. I had no idea you had even returned to England. I arrived 2 days ago to find my family in an uproar, and London society buzzing with gossip about a cancelled wedding," Alexander said, his expression growing grim. "When I learned the details of what had transpired, I knew I had to act quickly. You said in your letter that you believe the accusations against my family were fabricated. What makes you so certain?" Alexander leaned forward slightly, his grey-blue eyes intense with conviction. "Because I know who was responsible for creating those false documents, and I know why they did it." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. "Who?" "My brother Charles," Alexander said quietly, "and my mother, the Dowager Duchess." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had suspected that someone with access to financial information and social connections had orchestrated her downfall, but she had never imagined that the conspiracy had come from within the Ravenshire family itself. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they want to prevent my marriage to Thomas? What could they possibly gain from destroying my reputation?" Alexander's expression grew even more serious. "Because they never intended for Thomas to marry you at all. The entire courtship, the engagement, the wedding preparations, all of it was designed to distract attention from their real plan." "What plan?" "To arrange a marriage between Thomas and Lady Catherine Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's daughter. A marriage that would bring significant political and financial advantages to our family, but which Thomas had repeatedly refused to consider." Eleanor felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So they allowed him to court me, knowing they would find a way to end the engagement before the wedding?" "Exactly." They needed Thomas to believe he was making his own choice, to feel that he was in love and planning his own future. But they always intended to manufacture a crisis that would force him to abandon you and turn to the bride they had selected for him. And Thomas? Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. Did he know about this plan? Alexander's expression softened with something that might have been pity. I don't believe so. Thomas is many things, but he's not deliberately cruel. I think he genuinely cared for you, but he's also weak-willed and easily influenced by our mother. When presented with evidence of your family's deception, he chose to believe it rather than fight for you. The confirmation of Thomas's weakness hurt almost as much as the original betrayal. Eleanor had loved him, had believed in his strength and integrity, had trusted him to stand by her when challenges arose. To learn that he had abandoned her so easily, without even giving her the chance to defend herself, was devastating. What evidence do you have of this conspiracy? Eleanor asked, forcing herself to focus on the practical aspects of the situation rather than her emotional pain. Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio. Letters between my mother and Lord Pemberton discussing the marriage arrangement, financial records showing payments to a forger who specializes in creating false documents. And most damning of all, a detailed timeline showing how they plan to orchestrate your downfall. He handed her the portfolio, and Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers. The documents inside were even more damaging than she had hoped. Not only did they prove that the accusations against her family were false, but they revealed the calculated cruelty with which the Ravenshire family had planned her humiliation. This is incredible, Eleanor said, looking up from the papers. With this evidence, I can clear my family's name and expose the truth about what really happened. Yes, Alexander agreed. But you should understand that using this evidence will create a massive scandal. My family's reputation will be destroyed, Thomas's engagement to Lady Catherine will be exposed as a political arrangement, and the entire ton will be forced to confront the fact that they participated in a deliberate act of cruelty. Eleanor considered this, weighing her desire for justice against the chaos that would inevitably follow. And you're willing to see your family destroyed to help me? I'm willing to see justice done, Alexander replied firmly. What my family did to you was unconscionable. They destroyed your reputation, humiliated you publicly, and damaged your prospects for the future, all to serve their own selfish interests. That cannot be allowed to stand. But surely there must be some way to resolve this without creating such a massive scandal. Alexander shook his head. My mother and Charles will never admit their wrongdoing voluntarily. The only way to clear your name is to expose their conspiracy publicly, with evidence that cannot be denied or explained away. Eleanor closed the portfolio and looked at the man who was offering to sacrifice his family's reputation for the sake of justice. Why are you doing this? You barely know me, and helping me will cost you dearly. Because it's the right thing to do, Alexander said simply, and because I've seen too much of the world to believe that family loyalty should trump basic human decency. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the decision before them hanging in the air between them. Eleanor knew that accepting Alexander's help would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone involved in the conspiracy that had destroyed her wedding day. If we do this, she said finally, if we expose the truth, what happens next? Even if my reputation is restored, Thomas and I can never be together now. Too much has happened. Too much trust has been broken. Perhaps, Alexander said gently, that's for the best. A man who would abandon you so easily, who would believe accusations against you without even giving you the chance to defend yourself, is not worthy of your love. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. And what about you? If you expose your family's conspiracy, you'll be ostracized by society, cut off from your own mother and brother. I've been cut off from them for years, Alexander replied with a slight smile. Physical distance has a way of clarifying one's priorities. I've built my own life, my own fortune, my own reputation. I don't need their approval or their acceptance. Eleanor studied his face, seeing the strength and independence that had allowed him to make such a difficult choice. Very well, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Let's expose the truth. Let's make sure that justice is served, whatever the cost. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since her humiliation at Ravenshire Manor, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. She had been cast out by the Ravenshire family, as if she were nothing, but she was not nothing. She was a woman of intelligence and integrity, and now she had an ally who was willing to fight for justice alongside her. The battle to clear her name would be difficult and painful, but for the first time in days, Eleanor believed that she might actually win it. The revelation, the grand ballroom of Pemberton House had been transformed for what was being billed as the social event of the season, a ball to celebrate the engagement of Duke Thomas Ravenshire to Lady Catherine Pemberton. The announcement had come just 1 week after Eleanor's humiliation, with society papers breathlessly reporting the romantic story of how the Duke had found true love after his unfortunate experience with a fortune-hunting impostor. But tonight, as London's elite gathered to celebrate what they believed was a triumph of true love over deception, they had no idea that they were about to witness the exposure of one of the most calculated conspiracies in the history of the ton. Eleanor stood in the shadows of the gallery overlooking the ballroom, watching the glittering crowd below, with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She was dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented her coloring perfectly, her dark chestnut hair arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the classical beauty of her features. But it was the steel in her emerald eyes that would have caught the attention of anyone who looked closely, the resolve of a woman who had been pushed too far and was finally ready to push back. Beside her, Alexander Ravenshire cut an imposing figure in his formal evening wear, his grey-blue eyes scanning the crowd below with the calculating gaze of a general preparing for battle. In his jacket pocket was the evidence that would destroy his family's reputation and expose the conspiracy that had ruined Eleanor's wedding day. "Are you certain you want to do this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the music and conversation drifting up from the ballroom below. "Once we begin, there will be no going back." "I'm certain," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. "These people participated in my humiliation through their silence and their willingness to believe the worst of me. They deserve to know the truth about what they witnessed. And Thomas, are you prepared to see him exposed as a weak-willed fool who was manipulated by his own family?" Eleanor felt a pang of pain at the mention of her former fiancé, but she pushed it aside. "Thomas made his choice when he abandoned me without even giving me the chance to defend myself. Whatever happens to him now is a consequence of his own actions." Alexander nodded, understanding the steel beneath her composed exterior. Over the past week, as they had worked together to prepare for this moment, he had come to admire not just Eleanor's beauty, but her intelligence, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. She had been wounded deeply by her family's betrayal, but she had not been broken by it. "Very well," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we make our entrance?" Together, they descended the grand staircase that led from the gallery to the ballroom floor, their appearance causing a ripple of shock and speculation to spread through the assembled guests. Eleanor's presence at a social gathering so soon after her public humiliation was surprising enough, but her appearance on the arm of Alexander Ravenshire, the Duke of Blackwood, and Thomas's own brother, was nothing short of scandalous. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to follow their progress across the ballroom. Eleanor could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, could hear the whispered speculation that followed in their wake, but she kept her head high and her expression serene. "Lady Eleanor," came a cold voice from behind them, and they turned to find the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire approaching with the kind of regal authority that had intimidated lesser mortals for decades. "How unexpected to see you here this evening. Mother," Alexander said with icy politeness, offering a bow that was perfectly correct, but notably lacking in warmth. "How lovely to see you again. I trust you're well." The Dowager's sharp blue eyes flicked between her son and Eleanor with obvious displeasure. "I'm quite well, thank you. Though I must say I'm surprised to see you escorting Miss Whitcomb to such an event. Surely you understand how inappropriate this appears." "I understand that it appears exactly as I intended it to appear," Alexander replied smoothly, as a gesture of support for a woman who has been grievously wronged. "Wronged?" The Dowager's voice carried a note of dangerous warning. "I think you may have been misinformed about the circumstances surrounding the cancelled wedding. Miss Whitcomb's family—" "Miss Whitcomb's family," Alexander interrupted, his voice cutting through the Dowager's words like a blade, "has been the victim of a deliberate campaign of lies and fabrication, a campaign that I intend to expose tonight in front of all these witnesses." The color drained from the Dowager's face, but her expression remained controlled. "Alexander, I think perhaps you should reconsider whatever it is you're planning. Family loyalty," Alexander said, his voice growing louder and attracting the attention of nearby guests, "should never require participation in cruelty and injustice." And what was done to Lady Eleanor was both cruel and unjust. By now a crowd was beginning to gather around them, drawn by the obvious tension between the Duke of Blackwood and his mother. Eleanor could see Thomas approaching through the crowd, his face pale with confusion and growing alarm. "Alexander," Thomas said as he reached them, his voice tight with strain, "what are you doing here? And why are you with—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence as his eyes met Eleanor's for the first time since their cancelled wedding. "I'm here to expose the truth," Alexander said, his voice now carrying clearly through the ballroom as more guests gathered to witness the confrontation. "The truth about the conspiracy that destroyed Lady Eleanor's reputation and forced you into an engagement based on lies and manipulation." "What conspiracy?" Thomas asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather portfolio containing the evidence he and Eleanor had gathered. "The conspiracy orchestrated by our mother and our brother Charles to prevent your marriage to Lady Eleanor and force you into an alliance with Lady Catherine Pemberton." The ballroom fell silent except for the rustle of silk and the soft gasp of shocked guests as Alexander opened the portfolio and began to read from the documents inside. "Letter dated 6 months ago, from the Dowager Duchess to Lord Pemberton. The arrangement we discussed proceeds according to plan. Thomas believes himself to be in love with the Whitcomb girl, but we will manufacture a crisis before the wedding that will force him to abandon her and turn to Catherine as we have arranged." The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the ornate clock in the corner of the room seemed to echo like thunder. Eleanor watched as the implications of Alexander's words sank in among the assembled guests, saw the shock and horror on faces that had been filled with judgment and condemnation just a week earlier. "That's impossible," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mother would never—" Financial records showing payment to one Marcus Whitfield, a known forger, for the creation of false documents purporting to show the Whitcomb family's financial difficulties. Alexander continued relentlessly. "Amount paid, £500, date of payment, 3 days before the wedding." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication as she watched the faces around her change from skepticism to dawning understanding. These were the same people who had sat in silence while she was humiliated and cast out. The same people who had been so quick to believe the worst of her character. "And finally," Alexander said, his voice ringing with authority, "a detailed timeline showing how the conspiracy was planned and executed, including the decision to wait until the wedding day itself to maximize Lady Eleanor's humiliation and ensure that she would be too devastated to fight back." He closed the portfolio and looked around the silent ballroom, his grey-blue eyes challenging anyone to dispute the evidence he had presented. "Lady Eleanor Whitcomb is guilty of nothing more than loving a man who was too weak to fight for her," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She was destroyed by a family that valued political advantage over human decency, and by a society that was too cowardly to demand proof before passing judgment." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before it was broken by an unexpected voice. "Is this true?" Lady Catherine Pemberton stepped forward, her face pale but her voice steady. "Was our engagement arranged by our families while Thomas was still courting Lady Eleanor?" Thomas looked at his fiancée with an expression of growing horror as the full implications of the conspiracy began to sink in. "Catherine, I believed I was choosing freely." "Answer the question," Catherine said firmly. "Was our engagement arranged by our families?" The Dowager Duchess stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "Catherine, my dear, you mustn't allow yourself to be influenced by these wild accusations. Alexander has clearly been deceived by this woman's lies." "The evidence speaks for itself," Alexander said, holding up the portfolio. "Every document can be verified, every payment traced, every lie exposed. The question now is what this gathering chooses to do with the truth." Eleanor felt all eyes turn to her, and she knew that this was her moment to speak, to reclaim the voice that had been silenced by humiliation and betrayal. "I loved Thomas Ravenshire with all my heart," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "I believed in his integrity, his strength, his commitment to truth and justice. I was wrong about his character, but I was not wrong about my own. I am not a fortune hunter, my family is not bankrupt, and I did not deserve to be cast out like I was nothing." She paused, looking around the room at faces that now showed shame rather than judgment. "But I am grateful," she continued, "for this experience. It has shown me who my true friends are, and it has revealed the character of the man I thought I loved. Most importantly, it has shown me that I am stronger than I ever imagined, and that I don't need the approval of people who are so quick to abandon justice for the sake of social convenience." The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of voices as guests began to react to what they had witnessed. Some called for the Dowager Duchess to respond to the accusations, others demanded to see the evidence for themselves, and still others simply stood in shocked silence as they processed the magnitude of the deception that had been revealed. Through it all, Eleanor remained calm and composed, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm, as he stood beside her like a pillar of strength and support. "What happens now?" she asked him quietly, her voice barely audible above the chaos around them. "Now," Alexander replied, his grey-blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You rebuild your life on your own terms, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to help you do it." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with vindication or justice, and everything to do with the man standing beside her. Alexander Ravenshire had sacrificed his family's reputation to defend her honor, had stood with her against the entire ton, had shown her what true strength and integrity looked like. "I would like that very much," she said softly, and for the first time since her humiliation at Ravenshire Manor, Eleanor felt not just hope, but genuine happiness beginning to bloom in her heart. The conspiracy had been exposed, the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. But more than that, Eleanor had discovered that being cast out by people who valued appearance over substance had led her to someone who valued her for exactly who she was. As the chaos continued around them, and London society struggled to process the scandal that would dominate conversation for months to come, Eleanor and Alexander stood together in the eye of the storm, two people who had found each other through adversity and discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources. The reckoning, the aftermath of the revelation at Pemberton House, sent shockwaves through London society that reverberated for weeks. The scandal was unprecedented, not just because of the conspiracy itself, but because of the public manner in which it had been exposed. Never before had such damning evidence been presented so dramatically, forcing the cream of English society to confront their own complicity in an act of calculated cruelty. Eleanor found herself in the strange position of being both vindicated and notorious. Her reputation had been restored, but she was now the center of attention in a way that made normal social interaction nearly impossible. Every appearance in public was met with stares, whispers, and the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for exotic animals or natural disasters. "The irony," she said to Alexander as they walked through the gardens of Blackwood Manor, "is that I'm now more famous than I ever was before the scandal, but it's not the kind of fame that makes one particularly welcome in drawing rooms." Alexander, who had been equally ostracized by polite society following his exposure of his family's conspiracy, smiled at her observation. "Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. I found that the people who are most eager to distance themselves from us are precisely the people whose company we're better off without." It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation at Pemberton House, and the legal and social consequences were still unfolding. The Dowager Duchess had been forced to withdraw from society entirely, her reputation so thoroughly destroyed that even her oldest friends refused to receive her. Lord Charles had been stripped of his inheritance and banished from the family estates, his role in the conspiracy making him a pariah among his former associates. Most surprisingly, Thomas had broken his engagement to Lady Catherine Pemberton and disappeared from London entirely. Some said he had gone abroad, others that he had retreated to a remote estate in Scotland. Lady Catherine, for her part, had handled the situation with remarkable grace, publicly stating that she could not marry a man who had been so easily manipulated and expressing her sympathy for Eleanor's ordeal. "Have you heard anything from Thomas?" Eleanor asked, though she was surprised to find that she felt more curiosity than pain when thinking of her former fiancé. "A letter arrived yesterday," Alexander replied. "He's gone to Italy, apparently. Says he needs time to think about what kind of man he wants to be. I suspect he's finally realized that he's been living his entire life according to other people's expectations rather than his own principles. Do you think he'll ever return?" "Eventually, but I don't think he'll be the same man who left." Sometimes a complete break from one's past is necessary for genuine growth. Eleanor considered this as they paused beside a fountain where water danced in the afternoon sunlight. Over the past weeks, she had come to know Alexander not just as her champion, but as a man of remarkable depth and complexity. His years in India had given him a perspective on life that was both worldly and philosophical, and his willingness to sacrifice his family relationships for the sake of justice had revealed a strength of character that she found deeply attractive. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you regret the choice you made?" "You've lost your family, your place in society, your inheritance. I've lost nothing that I valued," Alexander interrupted gently, "and I've gained something far more precious." "What's that?" "The respect of a woman whose opinion matters more to me than all of society's approval combined." Eleanor felt her heart flutter at the intensity in his grey-blue eyes. Over the weeks they had spent together, fighting for justice and rebuilding their reputations, she had begun to realize that her feelings for Alexander had evolved far beyond gratitude or admiration. He was everything that Thomas had not been: strong, principled, willing to stand alone if necessary for what he believed was right. "Alexander," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Eleanor's heart race with both hope and fear. She had been betrayed so thoroughly by Thomas that the idea of trusting her heart to another man terrified her, but she had also learned that life was too short and too uncertain to waste time on anything less than complete honesty. Alexander stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Eleanor, I've been in love with you since the moment I saw you standing in that ballroom, refusing to be broken by the cruelty that had been inflicted upon you. Your courage, your integrity, your refusal to compromise your principles even when it would have been easier. You're everything I've ever wanted in a partner. Even though I come with scandal and notoriety, even though associating with me has cost you your family, especially because of that," Alexander said firmly, "you've shown me what real strength looks like, what it means to fight for what's right regardless of the personal cost. I would rather face the world's disapproval with you than have the world's approval without you." When he kissed her, it was with a passion and tenderness that made Eleanor understand the difference between the shallow infatuation she had felt for Thomas and the deep, abiding love that was growing between her and Alexander. This was not the desperate romance of youth, but the mature love of two people who had been tested by adversity and chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice would cost. "Marry me," Alexander said when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "Not because of duty or social expectation or family pressure, but because we choose each other freely and completely." "Yes," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. But are you prepared for the scandal it will cause? The Duke of Blackwood marrying the woman who was cast out by his own family?" "Let them talk," Alexander said with a smile that was both loving and defiant. "We'll give them something worth talking about." Their engagement was announced quietly, without the fanfare that had accompanied Eleanor's previous betrothal, but the news still created a sensation, with society papers struggling to decide whether to present it as a romantic triumph or a shocking breach of family loyalty. The wedding itself was held at Blackwood Manor, with only a small gathering of friends and family members who had stood by them throughout the scandal. Eleanor's parents, who had been devastated by the conspiracy against their daughter, were overjoyed to see her find happiness with a man who truly valued her worth. "You look radiant," Lady Catherine Whitcomb said, as she helped her daughter prepare for the ceremony. "More beautiful than I've ever seen you." "I feel beautiful," Eleanor replied, studying her reflection in the mirror. She wore a gown of ivory silk that was elegant in its simplicity, with her dark chestnut hair arranged in a style that emphasized the classical beauty of her features. But it was the happiness in her emerald eyes that truly transformed her appearance. "Are you certain about this?" her father asked when he came to escort her to the chapel. "Alexander is a good man, but marrying him means accepting permanent exile from the society you were raised to navigate." "Papa," Eleanor said, taking his arm with a smile, "I've learned that there are many different kinds of society. I'd rather be welcomed by people who value character over connections than accepted by people who are willing to participate in cruelty for the sake of social convenience." The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity, with Alexander and Eleanor exchanging vows that they had written themselves, promises of partnership, support, and unwavering loyalty that reflected the trials they had already faced together. "I promise to stand with you against whatever challenges we may face," Alexander said, his voice strong and clear as he looked into Eleanor's eyes. "To value your judgment, support your dreams, and never ask you to compromise your principles for the sake of social acceptance. I promise to be your partner in all things," Eleanor replied, her voice equally steady despite the tears of joy that threatened to fall. "To face the world's judgment with courage, to build a life based on love rather than expectation, and to never forget that the greatest strength comes from choosing to do what's right, regardless of the cost." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to echo through the manor's ancient halls. Eleanor and Alexander had found each other through scandal and adversity, but they had built their love on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that would weather any storm. 2 years later, the garden party at Blackwood Manor was a far cry from the glittering balls and formal gatherings that typically marked the London social season. Instead of elaborate decorations and ostentatious displays of wealth, the event was characterized by simple elegance, genuine warmth, and the kind of relaxed atmosphere that encouraged real conversation rather than social posturing. Eleanor stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, watching their guests mingle among the flower beds and beneath the ancient oak trees that had shaded the estate for centuries. She wore a gown of soft lavender silk that complemented her coloring perfectly, her dark chestnut hair arranged in a simple but elegant style that emphasized the natural beauty of her features. But it was the contentment in her emerald eyes and the genuine smile on her lips that would have caught the attention of anyone who remembered the devastated woman who had been cast out of Ravenshire Manor just over 2 years ago. "Admiring your handiwork?" Alexander asked as he joined her on the terrace, offering her a glass of champagne and settling beside her with the easy familiarity of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. "Admiring our handiwork," Eleanor corrected, accepting the champagne and leaning against his shoulder, with a contentment that still surprised her with its depth. "This was as much your vision as mine." The garden party was indeed a reflection of both their personalities, Eleanor's love of beauty and genuine hospitality, combined with Alexander's preference for substance over show. The guests were an eclectic mix of people chosen for their character rather than their social position, fellow philanthropists, artists, writers, reformers, and others who shared their commitment to making the world a better place. "Have you seen the latest edition of the Times?" Alexander asked, producing a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket. "The announcement is on the front page." Eleanor took the paper and read the headline with satisfaction. "Ravenshire conspiracy trial concludes. Dowager Duchess sentenced to social exile. Lord Charles stripped of inheritance." The legal proceedings that had followed the exposure of the conspiracy had been swift and decisive. The evidence that Alexander had gathered was so comprehensive and damning that even the most skilled barristers had been unable to mount an effective defense. The Dowager Duchess had been found guilty of fraud, conspiracy and defamation, while Lord Charles had been stripped of his position as heir and banished from polite society. "And Thomas?" Eleanor asked, though she felt only mild curiosity about her former fiancé rather than the pain that had once accompanied thoughts of him. "Returned from Italy last month," Alexander replied. "Apparently he's taken up residence at a small estate in the countryside and is attempting to rebuild his life on more honest foundations. I'm told he's become quite the philanthropist, working with local charities and trying to make amends for his past weakness." Eleanor felt a moment of sympathy for Thomas, a man who had been as much a victim of his family's manipulation as she had been, though he had suffered less dramatic consequences. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Destroying your family's reputation, giving up your inheritance, choosing justice over loyalty." "Never," Alexander replied without hesitation, his grey-blue eyes meeting hers with the intensity that still made her heart race. "How could I regret the choices that led me to you?" Their courtship had been unconventional by any standard, beginning as it had with a shared commitment to justice rather than romantic attraction. But over the months that had followed the exposure of the conspiracy, friendship had deepened into something far more profound. Alexander had proven himself to be everything that Thomas had not: strong, principled, willing to fight for what he believed in, and completely devoted to Eleanor's happiness. Besides, Alexander continued with a smile that transformed his serious features, "I've gained far more than I've lost. A wife I adore, a purpose that fulfills me, and the respect of people whose opinions actually matter." Eleanor felt her heart swell with love for this remarkable man who had sacrificed everything to defend her honor and had never once made her feel that she owed him anything in return. "Speaking of purposes that fulfill us," she said, gesturing toward a group of young women who were engaged in animated conversation near the rose garden, "I believe our scholarship recipients are plotting something." The Blackwood Foundation for Women's Education had been one of their first joint ventures, providing opportunities for intelligent young women from modest backgrounds to pursue advanced education. The young ladies currently gathered in their garden were the Foundation's inaugural class, and their presence at the party was a source of immense pride for both Eleanor and Alexander. "Probably planning to change the world," Alexander observed with satisfaction. "Exactly as we hoped they would." "Alexander," Eleanor said, her voice growing serious as she turned to face him fully, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" he asked, noting the change in her tone. "I'm with child," Eleanor said simply, watching as joy and wonder spread across his features. "We're going to have a baby." Alexander set down his champagne glass and pulled her into his arms, his face radiant with happiness. "Eleanor, that's wonderful. Are you certain?" "Quite certain," she replied, laughing at his expression. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday." "A child," Alexander repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Our child. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though his expression left little doubt about his feelings. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Alexander replied, spinning her around in a circle before setting her gently back on her feet. I'm ecstatic, terrified, overwhelmed, and more grateful than I ever thought possible. As they stood together on the terrace, surrounded by the sounds of their guests' laughter and conversation, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been cast out by the Ravenshire family as if she were nothing, her reputation destroyed and her future seemingly ruined. But that devastating experience had led her to discover her own strength, to find her true purpose, and most importantly, to meet the man who would become her partner in every sense of the word. Alexander had arrived at the darkest moment of her life, like an avenging angel, armed with evidence and determination to see justice done. What neither of them had expected was that their alliance would blossom into love, that their shared commitment to truth would become the foundation for a marriage that was everything Eleanor had once dreamed of, and more. "Do you think," Eleanor asked as they watched their guests enjoying the party they had created together, "that we'll be able to give our child the kind of life we both wished we'd had? A life based on love and principle rather than social obligation?" "I think," Alexander replied, his arm tightening around her waist, "that our child will grow up knowing that they are valued for who they are rather than what they possess. They'll understand that true strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and they'll know that love, real love, is worth fighting for." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the child growing within her and the world they would help create for the next generation. It would be a world where character mattered more than connections, where justice was more important than social convenience, and where love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. "I love you, Alexander Ravenshire," she said, using his full name as she had on their wedding day. "And I love you, Eleanor Ravenshire," he replied, his voice filled with the same wonder and gratitude that had characterized their entire relationship. "Thank you for being brave enough to fight for the truth. Thank you for being strong enough to survive what they did to you. And thank you for being generous enough to build a new life with me." As the afternoon light began to fade and their guests prepared to depart, Eleanor and Alexander remained on the terrace, planning for the future they would create together. They had weathered the storm of scandal and emerged stronger, had built a love that was tested by adversity and proven unbreakable. The society that had once cast Eleanor out as if she were nothing had learned that she was in fact everything, a woman of courage, intelligence, and integrity who had refused to be broken by their cruelty, and in trying to destroy her, they had inadvertently led her to the man who would love and cherish her exactly as she deserved. Their story had become legend in London society, not just as a tale of scandal and revenge, but as proof that love could triumph over manipulation, that trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, and that the strongest marriages were those that survived their worst challenges to emerge even stronger on the other side. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor and Alexander went inside to join their remaining guests, ready to celebrate not just their current happiness, but the bright future they would build together, a future filled with love, purpose, and the knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for all along. The Duke's wealthy brother had indeed arrived at the perfect moment, but not just to expose a conspiracy or restore a reputation. He had arrived to claim the woman who would become his partner, his equal, and his greatest love, proving that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Their child would grow up hearing the story of how their parents met through scandal, but found love through truth, how they stood together against the world's judgment and built something beautiful from the ashes of injustice. It would be a legacy of courage, integrity, and the unwavering belief that love, true love, was always worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Did Eleanor and Alexander's journey from scandal to true love capture your heart? If this tale of justice, redemption, and unexpected romance moved you, please like this story and subscribe for more captivating historical dramas. Share this with someone who loves stories where the underdog triumphs and true love conquers all. Which moment touched you most? Eleanor's brave stand for truth or Alexander's sacrifice for justice? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest romantic adventures.